When sir will join, I will inform you.
Okay, now I feel honored to invite keynote speaker of this national seminar, Professor Sachin Ketkar sir, to deliver his keynote address. Dr. Sachin Ketkar sir.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes.
So, good afternoon, all of you. And I would like to begin by thanking the organizers of this excellently organized seminar on reflections of society and culture in Indian literature in English, especially Dr. Atish Afide. I would also like to thank all the dignitaries on the stage, Dr. Tengshe, Dr. Nivargi, Dr. Dhananjay Devkar, and Dr. Pathan, who so generously introduced me. So I want to thank all of you for having me here and asking me to share my views and my research on this area. It's my honor and pleasure to deliver the keynote address in front of all the esteemed dignitaries, research scholars, colleagues, teachers, and students of Indian writing in English. I won't take up much of your time, and I would directly go on to present what I have to say as part of the keynote address. So I would like to begin by sharing my screen. What I would like to do is I would first touch upon certain contentious issues, some of the controversies, debates, and contestations around Indian writing in English, Indian literature in English, and look at specifically Indian poetry in English, because I feel that somehow this is a marginalized domain when it comes to research and academic attention given to it, because most of the attention seems to be focused on Indian fiction in English. But even then, if time permits, I would compare the observations that I made regarding Indian poetry in English with Indian fiction in English, especially in a wonderful article written by Rajeshwari Sundar Rajan, one of the esteemed literary critics. My perception, my perspective of Indian writing in English has been that of a creative writer myself, a translator, as well as a researcher in comparative studies. So when I look at Indian literature in English, my eyes, comparative eyes, also move from Marathi literature and Gujarati literature and Hindi literature, though I won't discuss it at length given the scope and time of today's presentation. My focus will be entirely on Indian writing in English, especially Indian poetry in English. So I would like to begin by sharing my screen. I would like to share my screen here. Can someone please?
Wait a second. I will allow you. Okay. I will allow you to share your screen. Just a second.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Now you can share your screen.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes. Okay.
I hope I'm visible. My screen is visible, right? Okay. So the theme of today being reflections of society and culture in Indian literature in English, I would like to first discuss some of the broad points, broad ideas and debates in the field. So, So these modern problematics of the term Indian literature in English, it themselves need some kind of critical unpacking, which will give us clues regarding what sort of debates, what sort of discussions, and what sort of contestations have happened in the field. The term Indian literature in English itself becomes a problematic term, and we can look at the problematics very briefly, because I think most of the papers today will be touching upon some of these themes and some of these problematics in today's paper presentations. So if you look at the term Indian literature in English, the very first term Indian actually begs the question, means what do you even mean by the term Indian? And the problematic of imagining nation as nation state or as historical and civilizational cultural space is one of the debates that is ongoing. Because once you consider Indian as nation state, the questions of citizenship and identity, the questions of colonial history become pertinent, because on Indian subcontinent, the modern nation state in which we live probably came into existence only with the colonial capitalism in the 19th century. And the earlier polities, political entities were mostly kingdoms of various kinds, and very often at loggerheads with each other, as our history shows. So the idea of modernity of nation state becomes one of the important, probably primary context of Indian literature in English. And this is something similar to many of literary history on Indian subcontinent. So colonial history of modern Indian state is one of the themes that keep on recurring in all the discussions of Indian literature in English. The other question is national identities of languages, writers, literatures, readers. Means what do you even mean by English? Is Indian English an Indian language, or is it international and global? And you may find it very queer and strange to talk about things like Indian literature in Marathi, because Marathi does not have to prove its identity. It does not need to provide its papers of citizenship, while Indian writing in English has often been asked to provide its citizenship papers, right? But nobody talks of Indian literature in Gujarati or Urdu or Tamil for that matter. So the question of national identity of literature itself is a perpetual kind of question that I think slowly and gradually is declining in the period of globalization, as the question of nation becomes less and less relevant to world literary systems. Then the questions of identity of the authors. How far can you say Salman Rushdie is an Indian, or V.S. Naipaul being Indian? So, or Bharti Mukherjee, or so many Rohinton Mistries, right up to Tishani Doshi and whatnot. What do you even mean when you say they are Indians? Because very often they occupy spaces which go beyond confines of nations. So these are some of the debates that I think started out when people started thinking of Indian literature in English. Comes then the question of language. What is its status? And I believe that another haunting question for Indian literature in English is the question of language. Is it the language of capitalism? Is it the language of colonizers? Is it the language of globalization? Or, as some of the Dalit writers have said, is it the language of emancipation? Because Marathi and Gujarati and all Indian languages are so deeply embedded into the casteist fabric of Indian society that English somehow seems to slide over these casteist social structures, given its international location. So if you look at Indian non-English Indian languages, then most of the dialects, bolis of Marathi, Gujarati, or Hindi have regional and caste coordinates, something which English seems to have slipped over. So does English provide some sort of emancipatory space to people. And I'm thinking of a Gujarati Dalit writer named Neerav Patel, who said that I'm bidding farewell to my mother tongue. I want to take up English because English gives me social mobility, while my Gujarati gives away my caste. Other question that very often bothers us is, are Indian literatures that are translated into English a part of Indian literature in English? Especially in drama, this seems to be a kind of non-issue, but has to be underlined, because most of the so-called dramatists that people research in Indian literature in English are people who write in the bhashas, in vernaculars, rather than in English, like Girish Karnad or Vijay Tendulkar or Mahesh L. Kunchwar or Alekar or Habib Tanveer or whoever. People who don't use English, but they are considered as part of Indian literature in English canon. But same does not happen for poetry or fiction. Anant Murthy is not seen as a post-colonial writer, while Salman Rushdie, for some reason, he is seen as post-colonial writer. So all these problems have actually played a role in thinking about Indian literature in English. My own position on this is that Indian literature in English should be seen as a part of the expanding concentric circles of world Englishes as proposed by Braj Kachru, where the first speaker of language, the native speakers, are the central circles, while the second language speakers and people with colonial history who have English as official language, like India, belong to the second circle. And then the third is the expanding circle of English, where non-colonized states like Japan or Germany or China also want English for their own reasons. So English is going beyond its ex-colonial spaces where it earlier occupied, thanks to things like internet and the free neoliberal economy. So English should, in my view, Indian literature in English should be seen as belonging to this whole expanding or dynamic of English as a language, which goes beyond these first and the second circles. That brings us to the third problematic of what do we even mean by literature? Because very often we take it for granted that by literature means what? Novels, poems, plays that are published, right? But if you look at non-colonial models of or concepts of nation, like in Sanskrit, for example, then you don't find similar categories at work. For example, the Western category of literatures as belles letters that seems to have emerged only in 17th or 18th century in France, as elegant writing, fine writing, or aesthetic writing, right, can be compared to terms like Sahitya or Kavya, which would include orality and performance. So Kavya is both Drushya and Shravya. Kavya is Rasatmakam Kavyam. So it's any utterance, right? And very often we assume that literature is something that is printed. It's the question of literacy and reading seems to be inseparable with the Eurocentric definition of literature. But when we look at countries like India, Indian subcontinent, where strong traditions of different kind of literary practices existed from thousands of years, then we have to take on board this tension and this conflict between the oral traditions. And what I'm reminded of, one of the earliest great novels in Indian writing in English, namely Kantapura, where the author who says that we cannot write like British, we should write in Indian, we should write like Indians. And he goes on to use kind of narrative devices that you find in Sthala Purana that every village has. So these are the non-Eurocentric narrative traditions that the author seems to incorporate in his own model of Indian novel in English. And this kind of merging or blending of the regional and the local narrative traditions and literary traditions with the Western models or genres is what I call, following Dionys Durizin, as interliterary. So I don't really look at modern Indian literatures, including Indian literature in English, as being influenced by Western literary traditions, because the idea of influence is deeply political one. And very well-known art critic named Partha Mitter calls the idea of influence as the Picasso-Mankey syndrome. What he wants to mean by that is that Picasso, in his own practice, borrowed a lot of artistic devices, techniques, themes from several parts of the world, like Africa, African masks, or so many others. And even if you remember, W.B. Yeats would use Japanese form of theater for his own purpose. All that is seen as sign of their genius. But if Indians borrow Western devices and Western genres and Western techniques, that is seen as being derivative. So influence, the idea of influence creates a kind of hierarchy between the donor and the receiver. So instead of looking at the relationship between the world literature in English and Indian writing in English, I would not use the term influence. Instead of that, I would use the term interliterary poetics, as used by Dionys Durizin, a very famous Czech scholar. So Kantapura does have a transnational context. It is part of world literature because it takes a genre which is European, but it is more of an appropriation. It's more of a cultural need rather than as just a passive receiver of a Western form. So interliterary process, the concept of interliterariness emphasizes this principle of selectivity, as Durizin calls it, and the agency of the receiver, right? So receivers are not passive people, but they appropriate consciously or unconsciously genres from other traditions for their own politics, own cultural politics, and their own artistic issues that they are dealing with. So Indian literature in English is simultaneously a part of world literature, transnational literary system, world republic of letters, as Pascal Casanova terms it. And it is also part of so-called national literature. So these are some of the main problematics about the term that we need to bear in mind when we embark on a research project on Indian literature in English, and how we go about researching it. Some of the theoretical issues on the term reflection that the seminar uses also have been discussed by various scholars and critics. So we need to take on board these deliberations about the notion of relationship between literature and social realities. And one of the earliest very famous formulation comes from M.H. Abrams, who uses the term the mirror and the lamp, where the notion of mirror is a neoclassical notion of mimesis, where you see society as mirroring, where you see literature as mirroring society, holding up mirror to society. And while the later formulations that you find in romantic poetry is the notion of lamp, where art is not seen as a reflection of society, but as an expression, emanation of light of the author's subject. So we may no longer use these kind of formulations of reflection and expression, but we have to keep in mind that the romantic notion of expression is very important for us because it indicates the emergence of modern subject, as the individual. And this emergence of the modern subject, the individual self, has something to do with the rise of the new bourgeoisie in the West and capitalism in the West. So the modern subject of romantic poetry or romantic lyric is something that we bear in mind even as we follow Indian poetry in English, as we are going to do later on. At the same time, we need to bear in mind some recent theoretical rethinking that has happened about the term reflection. You no longer see literature as merely reflecting social realities, but as a discourse, as ideology, and as representation. And what do you mean by discourse is you see literature as part of power knowledge nexus, as part of something that claims to provide truth claims. And as Foucault is building upon Nietzsche, Nietzsche says that will to truth is actually will to power. So literature is often seen from this Foucauldian Nietzschean lenses, especially in the post-colonial studies. And literature as representation of society would then be caught up in the politics of representation, as who represents who and why. For instance, the Orientalist representations of Oriental society. And as Edward Said has famously argued about how the constructions or representations of the East, right, were not faithful reflections, but constructions, right? And these constructions are embedded in the questions of colonialism and the power hierarchy within which it operates. And it is in this context that Gayatri Spivak's very famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, raised the question whether can cosmopolitan elite, like the most of the writers of Indian literature in English, represent the marginalized and the oppressed, right? Right from Mulk Raj Anand speaking about the untouchable, or Arvind Adiga writing about Balaram Halwai, or even in his later short stories where he talks about the fringes and the margins of society, or even Arundhati Roy who talks about Dalits. So can or should these cosmopolitan elites represent, speak for the subalterns? Do they have that right? Becomes one of the contestations and questions before Indian writing in English, especially. The questions of ideology and hegemony that come from Gramsci and Althusser, which informs most of the post-colonial studies, especially Spivak and others. The questions of casteless modernity of Anglophone Indian literature, as Toral Gajrawala has recently pointed out in her famous book, Untouchable Fictions. She talks about how Mulk Raj Anand's Dalit is not, though he speaks in Oxford accent, right? This kind of representation evades the issue of caste oppression. Caste is not seen as primary mode of oppression and discrimination. Rather, given Mulk Raj Anand's own Marxist leanings, it's seen as class conflict rather than caste conflict. And this is what Toral Gajrawala has said. So all these debates about Indian literature from post-colonial studies will obviously have to be brought in when we start thinking about Indian literature in English. So having said that, I'm going to look at some of the poems that are very important for Indian literature in English. And I will take a kind of historical view of it. I will just talk about 4 short poems, not the entire poem, some extracts from these poems, and see how these poems deal with these questions that we have been talking about till now, as an instance of our framework that we are trying to create about Indian literature in English. So the first poem goes back to 1928, though one of the earliest important poetry collection that appeared in English came from the same poet, Henry Vivian Louis Desrosiers. And this is an extract from this poem, the first poem, To India, My Native Land. And it is from his collection called Fakir of Jangira, Metrical Tales and Other Poems. Desrosiers himself was of Portuguese-British origins, somebody called Anglo-Indian. And his nationalism is something that we need to understand. So the locations of the authors become one of the important questions before Indian literature in English. And though people like M.K. Nayak and Srinivas would talk about modern Indian literature in English as the youngest of literature, I feel that it is one of the oldest modern Indian literature. Means Rajaram Mohan Roy is writing long time before Chiplunkar, or even before that, before Lok Hitwadi or others are writing in Marathi, right? So modern Indian literature in English seems to predate modern Gujarati or Marathi literature. So it is not really it's not a baby literature as some people seem to claim, because it's 200 years old. It is older than modern Indian literatures. In fact, if you look at this poem, then it comes almost 60 years before Keshav Sut is writing his poem, right? So Desrosiers is writing almost half a century before modern poetry in Marathi seems to become prominent. Almost a contemporary, even before probably Savitribai Phule is writing poetry, or Jyotiba Phule is writing poetry in Marathi. You find a modern poetry seems to emerge in English. So there is some sort of relationship between kind of hybridity, if that's the term to be used, about the author's own location, Anglo-Indian, and his nationalism. So let's look at this poem to see what kind of poetry, what does poetry tell us about the social and cultural realities. So the poem goes something like this. My country, in thy days of glory past, a beauteous halo circled round thy brow, and worship as a deity thou wast. Where is that glory? Where is that reverence now? The eagle pinion is chained down at last, and groveling in the lowly dust art thou. Thy minstrel hath no reed to view for thee, save the sad story of thy misery. Well, let me dive into the depth of time and bring out from the ages that have rolled a few small fragments of those wrecks sublime, which human eye may never more behold. And let the guerdon of my labor be, my fallen country, one kind wish from thee. My dream was it, thy spirit came to me to visit in sleep. Oh, that my slumber might have been more lengthened and more deep. Was it a visitant from heaven that to my pillow came and answered in thine own loud voice? Whenever I named thy name, not half so sweet the nightingale unto the rosebud sing, as came thy voice of other days, with which my ear still rings. So what does this poem tell us? That the speaker of the poem, the persona, almost assumes the role of a minstrel or a bard or a kind of nightingale. That's the persona that the poet adopts. And the poet believes, the speaker in the poem believes that the minstrel, this poet, has no wreath to view for the country, save the sad story of thy misery. Right? So that's why he goes back to glorious past to dig out various fragments from the glorious past. So the project which Derozio seems to have is to create a nationalist literature, create a body of nationalist literature, because contemporary scene is full of sad and misery. It is as if Derozio is the prophet of Indian literature in English, and you can almost crown him as the prophet. If you look at the language of his poem, then it is deeply influenced by the Romantic poetry. It is very abstract, very rhetorical, and full of rhetorical flourishes that are typical of Romantic and Victorian poetics. However, his project, his cultural need, it is not that he is a passive recipient of Western poetics. He is having his own agenda, and his agenda is to construct a national literature, which is at par with world literature. And this nationalist project separates Romanticism of Derozio from Romanticism of Wordsworth, something that we need to bear in mind. And this construction of nation has to be seen in its historical context. And the context is that of colonial modernity and construction of anti-colonial nationalism, which we have to keep in mind is very different from the kind of nationalism that we face today. It's not an anti-national, anti-colonial nationalism. It is more of majoritarianism, which can become very oppressive. So this is the trope, this is the form that was used almost for 100 years in Indian writing in English, because we find Aurobindo writing Savitri in 19-something, early part of 20th century, and you find Sarojini Naidu writing her poems. So almost for 100 years, this is the rhetoric, these are the poetics of Indian writing in English, which were soon to change in coming decades. So what model lasted for 100 years will collapse with this new form. And this is the new kind of poetry that has emerged in the 50s and 60s. In fact, Nizam Ezekiel's poem called Background, Casually, is found in Hymns in Darkness in 1976. But you can compare it with Derozio's poem and see what kind of representation of society that you see here, and what is the subject of the modernist lyric here. So poem goes something like this: a poet rascal crown, and he's talking about himself. The frightened child who would not eat or sleep, a boy of meager bone. He never learned to fly a kite. His borrowed top refused to spin. I went to Roman Catholic school, a mugging Jew among the wolves. They told me I had killed the Christ. That year, I won the scriptures prize. A Muslim sportsman boxed my ears. I grew in terror of the strong, but undernourished Hindu lads. Their prepositions, always wrong, repelled me by passivity. He's talking of the passive constructions of Indian English. One noisy day, I used a knife at home on Friday. Nights, the prayers were said. My morals had declined. I heard of yoga and of Zen. Could I perhaps be a rabbi sent? The more I searched, the less I found. 22, time to go abroad. First the decision, then a friend to pay the fare. Philosophy, poverty, and poetry, three companions shared my basement room. So if you look at the persona, the mask that poet is putting on, he's no longer the bardic, the prophetic one of Aurobindo or Derozio. It's not a nightingale that is singing like Toru Dutt, right, in a Wordsworthian kind of tropes. But and it's more of poet rascal clown, right? So what led to this shift from prophet, bard, and minstrel to poet rascal clown, who is a Bene Israelite, a complete minority, and he finds himself at odds with society. the majoritarian one. So wherever he goes, he feels himself misfit, an outsider. So when this poet Rascal Clown went to Roman Catholic school, he was seen as a mugging Jew by those Roman Catholic students, and they said that he had killed the Christ. But he won the scripture prize for Bible that year. And then Muslim sportsmen boxed my ears, and Hindus would also terrorize him. Their prepositions were always wrong. So you can see one of the themes, primary themes of this kind of poetry is the question of alienation, question of being not fitting into the majoritarian nation, majoritarian abstract nation that is created by Aurobindo and Derozio. He is somebody who is in margins, a minority. And if you look at modernist poetry later on, you find this preoccupation of marginality, of identity, as one of the chief themes of Indian literature in English. You can think of Adil Jasawala, you can think of K.K. Darwala, you can think of many writers, Rohinton Mistry, so on and so, who come from minority communities, and they find themselves not being able to fit into, as outsiders, into this idea of nation, which is so Hindu Brahminical, so majoritarian. And that is one of the important themes of the poetry. If you look at the rhetoric, the interliterary poetics, then you can see that it is deeply influenced by modernist international poetry of Eliot and Auden and Yeats and Stevens and whatnot. And you can also see that the stylistic shift that has happened away from the romantic abstract rhetorical flourishes of Aurobindo and Derozio. We find it's more of autobiographical realism. It is kind of ironic and sarcastic. So irony and sarcasm about the whole question of nations as being seen from margins rather than from the center becomes one of the prominent themes of modernist notions of literature and identity and social issues. And you can see that protest against homogenizing impulse of majoritarian impulse, majoritarian nationalism, is what defines poetry of and probably Indian literature in English from 1940s, 50s onward. And Ezekiel is the prophet, like Derozio was, of the whole school of modernists. In fact, he's one of the presiding deities of modernist Indian poetry. I would also want to point out one another preoccupation, because then I will come to the postmodernist Indian literature in English, postmodernist poetry in English. And the other poem that I want to talk about belonging to the modernist idiom is a very famous poem by Dalit Chitre, Tukaram in heaven, Chitre in hell. And where the speaker in the poem says, the persona you can see is still that of poet clown rascal, right? It's no longer bard, prophet, or minstrel of Derozio. He says, I bequeath to you my fossil and my dossier, and I join the saints' immortal choir. Tukaram in heaven, Chitre in hell, sing the same song centuries apart. Their bone derives from the same stone that stands erect at Pandharpur in the shape of a god. Both gentle and rude, and always unmoved. The river flows by like so many people. While this stands by itself, is a spire and a steeple. History is dust. In this kind of summer, the heat is lasting truth. So if you look at this extract from a longer poem, just like we looked at casually, background casually, You can see that preoccupation for Chitre and many other modernists is to, like maybe Raja Rao, is to relate this world literary exposure to world literature with the regional and the local traditions. And Chitre is deliberately engaging with the Sant Vangmay tradition, especially the tradition of Tukaram and Jnaneshwar. And for Chitre, what it means being Indian is to belong in certain way to the tradition of Tukaram rather than the tradition of Vedic literature as it was for Aurobindo and others. So for Aurobindo, the idea of nation was defined by national culture, seems to be defined by the Vedic culture. But for Chitre, it's the regional, the native, and the local. And this preoccupation is kind of interliterary blending of two kinds of poetics, of irony and sarcasm and surrealism that comes from world literature, and the traditions of Sant Vangmay comes together. So that is one of important characteristics of modernist poetry in English and modernist literature in Indian writing in English. Because as in some way, as Meenakshi Mukherjee has said, that anxiety of Indianness seems to be one of the obsessions for Indian writers in English, and trying to give evidence for that nationality, because the word Indian and English seem to be at problematic loggerheads. So Derozio is deeply suffering from this anxiety of Indianness. Yes, he is Indian, but he does that by going to Sanskritic past. Chitre does that by going back to nativist past. So this is a kind of post-nationalist, nativist development in Indian literature in English that you are looking at. Which brings us now to the contemporary poetry, and something that I will call postmodern contemporary poetry in English. And for that, let us take a look at a couple of poems very quickly. This one is by Jerry Pinto, a well-known translator from Marathi, and he belongs to this generation of Indian writers in English, contemporary generation. And his poem is titled Alt Control Delete. Alt Control Delete. So easy to delete. Backspace, or even in extremis, Alt Control Delete all at once. Alt against parallel universe, the parallel possibilities, the parallel lives. Control, the illusion slips away if you look at it directly. Delete does not exist. So this small poem by Jerry Pinto in some way continues the modernist persona of poet rascal clown, but the content of his poetry and language are deeply informed by recent developments in English. This is not the English of Derozio, nor is it English of Nissim Ezekiel. This is the English of WhatsApp generation, probably. It's the Alt Control Delete generation, if you want to use that word. And you can see that the question of nation does not remain a kind of burden. Jerry Pinto does not have to prove his nationality, right? So in some sense, the contemporary Indian writers are in English are more comfortable at home, which is not a home. So home and the world, right? So they are at home in the world as well as they are at home outside their nation. And nation and national identity does not remain a kind of burning question for the poets of this generation. So you can look at this as a kind of postmodernism, because in modernism, there was a tendency to turn towards Bhakti traditions to prove your Indianness. While in the early traditions of Aurobindo, you had to prove your Indianness by going to Vedic times and Upanishads and Savitri and all that, Mahabharata and Ramayana. There is no such a desperation to prove Indianness. So the anxiety of Indianness, though it's not completely disappeared, is lot diluted in the postmodern period. The language of postmodern Indian poetry is informed by globalization, technology, which seems to be around us. And the last poem that I want to talk about is by more contemporary, more recent poet, Arjun Rajendran, born in 21st century, probably, if I'm not mistaken, or in the 90s, I'm not very sure. And the poem is called After Van Gogh, Skull of a Skeleton Burning with a Burning Cigarette. And this is the name of a very famous painting by Van Gogh called Skull of Skeleton with Burning Cigarettes. And the speaker in this poem sees this painting in the Van Gogh Museum. But what comes to his mind is the phantom of Indrajal comics, a teetotaler who never lit a fag. Fag is also the burnt cigarette end, but then fag also is a slang for a homosexual. Lived in a skull cave. He's talking of phantom of Indrajal comics, and was unaware that his image, a brand of peppermint cigarette, was once popular. I'm not sure if many people from you remember this sweet peppermint cigarettes with the cover of skull, which was once popular among Indian kids, including a boy who would grow up to become a renowned oncologist. This doctor, in his book, observes that his colleagues smoke while researching the link between cancer and tobacco. Years later, inside the Van Gogh Museum, that sad irony tugs at him from a painting. How the phantom, nemesis of pirates, guardians of deep woods, was relegated by commerce to a stick of peppermint. One of the primary themes of postmodern Indian literature and poetry in particular is commercialization and consumerism, which does not feature so prominently in the modernist generations of Ezekiel or Chitre. And the references to popular culture like Phantom of Indrajal comics or the peppermint cigarette, right? All these references to popular consumer culture are brought in instead of references to Tukaram and Jnaneshwar. So this obsession with bhakti also seems to have declined in postmodernity, and it is how. So the lived realities of postmodern Indian poets seem to be popular consumerist culture that is created after globalization in the 90s and after the rise of information technology revolution in the mid 90s. So these are some of the features of postmodern poetry. So in some sense, it seems to continue its relationship right back up to Derozio, or its desire to construct a kind of national idiom that would establish you in international or world literary zone. But ideas of nations have changed. The idea of nation in Arjun Rajendran or in Jerry Pinto are not the ideas of nations that nativists had or post-colonial nativists had, nor is it the idea of Aurobindo and Derozio. It's more of a transnational context, which seems to get more and more prominence in postmodern period. So one more preoccupation of postmodern Indian literature in English, Indian poetry in English, is the rise of Dalit idiom by Meena Kandasamy, and Chandramohan. And something that you don't see in the 60s or 70s of Indian poetry in English. But you see the Dalit idiom coming up very strongly in Marathi in the 60s. But you don't see that because English being still seen or had the place of English was urban, upper caste, middle class, something that seems to have expanded further into inclusion of many other communities apart from the upper caste. So another very interesting shift between Chitre's generation and Arjun Rajendran's generation is going beyond binaristic formulations of gender. For example, Kamala Das, who belongs to an earlier generation, her feminism is based on binary between masculine and feminine, right? It's essentialized, though she does talk about eunuchs and all that. But this kind of essentialist feminism seems to have been taken over by Dalit feminism, which is very stridently found in Meena Kandasamy. So she is attacking, she is rejecting all the kinds of ideas of nationhood because, as Dalits would put it, they don't have any nation, right? They are prisoners of their society. They are the victims of their society rather than belonging to a nation. So they reject all the cultural and literary traditions that Derozio or even Dilip Chitre would proudly carry. So Tukaram and Sant Vangmay, which is a matter of pride for the nativists, is not seen as something that is something that you should be proud of by people like Meena Kandasamy. So caste and gender essentialism is challenged in the postmodern Indian poetry. And you find that writers like Bhushan Merchant or Raj Rao, R. Raj Rao, among others, are writing from an LGBTQ perspective, questioning the hegemony of heterosexuality. So you can see the imagining of nations that has happened was in Derozio was the project of constructing a grand nation out of miserable present. Nation for Ezekiel and Chitre was no longer this homogeneous majoritarian Hindu nation, but a minoritarian regional perspective of a misfit, of an outsider. So alienation seems to be one of the prominent themes in the modernist poetry. But when we come to the postmodern time, this anxiety of Indianness, it does not feature greatly in Indian writing in English. In fact, I was reading a short story by Arvind Adiga called Sultan's Battery. And it reminded me of Astrologer's Day by R.K. Narayan. So had R.K. Narayan been writing today, then that would be very, very contemporary. So this is an overview of three moments, one being the longest one of 100 years in Indian writing in English, the second being slightly less long, and the third being immediate 30 years period that we are looking at. So in a nutshell, I have just taken a walk through the history of Indian writing in English, give you an overview of how society and cultures are represented and contested. If time permits, I will just quickly look at what Rajeshwari Sundar Rajan has said about recent fiction in English. And she points out in a very famous essay called After Midnight's Children, after some notes on new Indian novels in English, she points out that the modernist poetry, modernist fiction of Salman Rushdie kind was influenced by Nehruvian socialism, Nehruvian belief in secularism, Nehruvian kind of model of elite secularism, right? What happened was this anglicized caste was slowly being displaced from Indian society with the rise of new regional and caste elites after 70s. And this new political formulation, and she says, quoting Sagarika Ghosh's novel called Gin Drinkers, where a character says that we are irrelevant Indians, right? So the feeling that the elites who spoke in Oxford accent or the expatriate English diasporic writers felt that they were irrelevant to political life. And can I request Mantha Padma to mute her mic? Because I'm just 5 minutes left for what I have to say. Just if you can mute her. Okay. Rajeshwari Sundar Rajan.
एडिट कसा करायचा ऑप्शन
Rajeshwari Sundar Rajan divides the writers on basis of their locations into 3 kinds, and that is very important. What she calls the immigrant writers or NRI writers. The second category is the exilic, and with exilic she means those writers who still want to retain their home in India. So they spend their time in India and abroad. They come and go back. Like, and she examples that she gives Altaf Tayarwala, Jeet Thail, Tishani Doshi, as against people like Salman Rushdie who have and Rohinton Mistry and Bharti Mukherjee who have settled abroad, Anita Desai among others. And the third is the resident kind of writers, which are based in India and talk about India very much for Indians. And for that, she includes Arundhati Roy and people like Indra Sinha. She says that these writers critique the idea of nation, which has become a big bad nation now. It's no longer a nation that is to be created. It's nation that is already created and now has become big and bad. And they are trying to critique this, but their own position of elite English speakers becomes a problem. They cannot really represent, say, for example, Dalits whom they talk about. So, for example, Arundhati Roy talks about them, or transgenders, or homosexuals, or the caste. Goes on to point out that the recent Indian fiction in English sees 3 important developments. One is the rise of non-fictional prose, which is very important. Second is the rise of popular Indian fiction, the Chetan Bhagat variety, and the followers of Chetan Bhagat. And the third that she sees is the literary fiction, right? You may think of Arvind Adiga, or you may think of Kiran Desai as contemporary literary fiction writers. So these 3 streams of Indian fiction in English seem to correspond to what we have been saying about Indian poetry in English. So there is also a development called popular Indian poetry in English, represented by people like Rupi Kaur and her Insta followers. So this Insta poetry is a counterpart of Chetan Bhagat and Amish Tripathi version of the new popular that is produced by globalization and liberalization and privatization. So having given this overview, I would just sum up what I have to say. That Indian writing in English has been simultaneously part of world system of literature and as well as the national system of literatures. And this kind of dual positioning is gives rise to a whole lot of paradoxes. The second point that I've been making, that the poetics and the genres have to be seen as interliterary rather than just the derivation of English or the Western models. So not just as copies of the Western, but creative appropriation for one's own cultural politics is how you should be looking at these writers. So this is what I have to say about the subject. So with that, I want to stop, and I want to thank the organizers once again for giving me an opportunity to share my views. And I wish you all the best for all the deliberations that are to follow. And I congratulate the organizers of the college for having this excellent seminar. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for your studious discourse on reflection of society and culture in Indian literature in English. Now, I would like to invite Sri